You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Will this French government, having passed its budget, be allowed to do any governing? Should we be cautiously pleasantly surprised by how well the Gaza ceasefire has held, and Tokyo's densely packed citizens hounded by their neighbours' dogs? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Philippe, Marlière and Daniella Peled will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the Washington Post's Eva Doe about her new book chronicling the rise and sort of fall of Huawei. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Philippe Marlière, Professor of French and European Politics at University College London, and Daniella Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Daniella, as our listeners will be by now wearily familiar, you have very often either just been to or are planning to attend a somewhat obscurantist museum.
Yes, I have just attended one in my own backyard, which I've been meaning to go to for a while, which is the Foundling Museum in not too far away from here, which is a museum of the 18th century foundling hospital where babies could be abandoned and might have a small chance of survival. It's a very lovely, slightly melancholy museum.
I would think they used to have a drawer, didn't they, where you could just deposit the unwanted infant.
This is one step above that. You have to be interviewed to see if you were sort of not too morally repugnant to leave your child there forever, and the child had to be disease-free. Although really, most of them died, so I don't know what they were hoping to achieve.
Sounds a jolly afternoon out.
I had a great time. Yeah.
But even more excitingly, coming up.
Yes. It's half term soon. My son and I are going to Fuerteventura, where rather than the beaches and the sort of water sports and so on, we're going to make a beeline to a really cool museum, which I've discovered. It's the Museum of Salt.
Right.
I can't even imagine what joys are going to await me there. Is it
next door to the Museum of Pepper?
That's a marketing opportunity if I ever heard one.
I mean, seriously though, there is quite a backstory to salt. Entire cultures and economies have risen and fallen on it.
My expectations are high.
And we can all take a wild guess at what the merchandise in the souvenir shop will primarily consist of.
I'll bring you back something speciality.
I please do. Please bring back some obscure specialty salt. Philippe, in words I believe I have never uttered in the light introductory banter section of the Daily, you have recently been to Altrincham.
Yes, surprisingly, I was there. It was to give a talk.
When you say surprisingly, did you think you were going somewhere else?
That wasn't a sort of career plan, if you like. I got that chance, that opportunity to make it to the north. First, I spent an afternoon in Manchester, and then went in this place called Altrincham, which is in the suburbs. You need to take the tram. It's quite a long journey to get there. Marketplace, quite nice and peaceful and beautiful. So, yeah.
These are all quotes for Altrincham's tourism posters. It's quite nice.
It's quite nice, yes. I think it really lives up to what you could expect from that kind of place. And I think it's coming from London. I spend a lot of time in London. I'm an academic, so I don't have the chance of traveling around like you journalists and around the world. And it's quite interesting to see that place. Very different from London, very different culture, population, and it's an interesting part of England. I'm quite fond of north of England, by the way.
Okay. Well, again, another quote for the tourism posters. I'm quite fond. Philippe Marlière, France.
Use it.
And France is where we are starting because the 2025 budget has been passed, at least for the moment. Prime Minister François Bayrou, well aware that he does not have the numbers in the National Assembly, has bounced it past Parliament using a constitutional clause, Article 49.3 if we're being picky, which allows minority governments such as Bayrou's to take the odd odd liberty in the interests of keeping the lights on. Listeners may recall Bayrou's predecessor, Michel Barnier, attempting the same manoeuvre in December and being consequently unhorsed. Bayrou is therefore also tempting a censure motion and unemployment. Philippe, is this budget likelier to stick? Would the National Assembly bin another one?
It seems that eventually that budget might be approved thanks to that device called the Article 49.3, which governments seldom use. They better not, because it's not very democratic. It's a bill which is passed without giving a chance to MPs to properly examine it and amend it. So there's no real scrutiny. So that was one of those articles that Charles de Gaulle wanted in his 1958 constitution, making sure that no government could be put on hold because it didn't have a majority to pass legislation. But you don't use it often because MPs resent that, and there's a downside to it, which is when you do that, you expose yourself as Prime Minister and with your government to a motion of no confidence, which will be tabled.
This is what happened to
on
Barnier.
Wednesday. So on Wednesday, you will have a motion of no confidence. That's a serious matter, because if MPs, there's a majority of MPs voting that motion of no confidence, it means the government will fall again. That's what happened to poor old Barnier over 3 months ago. It didn't last long because he had the whole left plus the far right, the National Rally, Le Pen's National Rally, ganging up and voting against him. He fell. This time around, it seems that Bayrou will be more luckier, because the socialists, so part of the left, have already announced that they will not vote the motion of no confidence, and it seems that the far right will also abstain. So it seems that he will survive to live another day.
Daniella, we do often talk to you about Israeli politics, and spoiler, we will be doing that later in this programme, and that is, of course, a country in which minority governments are very often a thing. But as a general principle, not in France or Israel, but just generally, does there come a point at which, even if the opposition is in the majority in the parliament, they really should just stop being difficult and let the government govern?
Well, I think there are sort of pluses and minuses of a minority government. I think we tend to assume that, it's de facto going to be weak and unstable, and they are obviously very vulnerable to no confidence votes. But actually, if we were to put a slightly positive spin on it, uncharacteristically for me, but there is also a very strong democratic argument to be made for them. It means that you need to have a more consensual form of politics. There needs to be more negotiation, and it also lawmakers have much more importance. The individual lawmakers are rather than the executive having all the power. So that is a bonus, and certainly some democratic systems, they're really not unknown. Scandinavia, for instance, has it's more often than not they have a minority government. And to be honest, I think when we look at the situation we are now politically, where we are increasingly fragmented, people are turning away from the majority, the mainstream parties, it seems almost inevitable that this is going to be a future way of doing business in politics. So it might be worth looking at how they can be used to democratic advantage, despite the clear vulnerabilities that they have.
I mean, in the specific current circumstances, and returning our focus to France, Philippe, do you get any sense, perhaps, that the general situation is perhaps focusing the minds of French lawmakers somewhat? Because things have changed since last time they did this, in that we now have a reinstalled president in the United States. He was only president-elect last time they tipped over the prime minister, who is, threatening his own NATO partners to the extent that France has vaguely floated the idea of sending soldiers to Greenland.
It's a very good question, because you would think that,
you would, given
the French conundrum, no majority in a house, and any government can only be minority. So you would think, like Danielle just very eloquently put it, that they would converge, they would try to find solutions, compromise, so that at least, even if they don't like each other, they can govern, they can have a majority and pass the budget to start with. I don't think that's really what they're doing. And I think in order to have a coalition, a minority government, which is often a coalition government made up of several parties, you need a particular political culture, which is lacking in France. You have it in Scandinavia, you have it in Belgium, the Netherlands. We don't have it in the UK.
Indeed not.
And we don't have it, French, we don't have it in France either. It takes time to build. And I think there seems to be a kind of discrepancy between the public, French voters, who are now getting tired of all this political instability. People are really waiting for the budget to be passed. Some people really rely on that for some funding to carry on their life. And the political class don't seem to be heading in that direction. It's still a lot of bickering, a lot of opposition, a lot of posturing. So I think it's interesting to follow, for instance, what the left is doing. A part of the left, notably Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Insoumise, is absolutely very radical in its opposition. Every opportunity it would like to censor the government, whereas the socialists are departing from that stand and are saying, well, look, we don't like this budget. It's not a progressive budget, but nonetheless, we're going to abstain because France needs a budget. So it may pay off for the socialists in the end. The voters might sort of feel that that's the right thing to do.
Hey, just a final thought on this, Daniella, and picking up that idea of a difference in political culture. I mean, I can remember going back to 2010 here in the UK, and certainly, I don't know whether British voters were necessarily tearing their hair out at the thought of a coalition government, but the British media seemed completely perplexed by such a thing when the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats formed a coalition in order to command a majority in the Commons. Does it necessarily take that long, do you think, for voters to get used to the idea, or is it just political journalists refusing to believe that things can change?
Well, I mean, I think the British public felt they had their fingers quite thoroughly burnt by the coalition government. I mean, and then you can see the results. The Lib Dems were hugely punished in subsequent elections. They've only managed to regain, I think, the public trust in the last.
The party came to remember 2010 as a catastrophic success.
Very good, very, very, very well put. Very well put. But you know, the British political system is something quite different, though, because we are very, very strongly weighted towards the centre. You know, the first past the post. It just the two main parties are really broad churches, and we saw the results in the last elections. Even if the main parties, even with the fragmentation that we're seeing all over Europe, even with that, the parliamentary results were really solid. So we have a level of protection in our system, and but certainly any kind of political change takes a lot of time for voters to get their heads around. And I think that the idea of a coalition would be. Yeah, I can't imagine a circumstance in which it would be really hugely popular anytime soon.
Well, to the Middle East, where fire remains ceased in Gaza, less so in the West Bank. At the weekend, 3 more Israeli hostages held in Gaza by Hamas were freed after nearly 16 months of captivity. In exchange, 183 Palestinian prisoners were released from Israeli jails. Negotiations on the second phase of the ceasefire agreement were due to begin today as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visits Washington, D.C. On the West Bank, however, Israeli operations are continuing. 23 buildings were destroyed yesterday in Jenin, for example, as part of what Israel claims was an operation against terrorist infrastructure. Daniella, if we look at the Gaza deal itself, risk of tempting fate, etc., but is this actually holding up better than a lot of people expected it might?
Oh, yeah, I think so, definitely. Phase 1, certainly. But as we look at phase 2, I think that this is much more perilous for many, many reasons. Certainly for Netanyahu's personal position. I mean, he's going to be in Washington all week. And it's important to note that this has a sort of benefit for him because it means he's going to have to miss a whole week's testimony in the criminal case against him for corruption. I mean, this is the thing that's hanging over. His political fate is constantly, in the balance. Some of the next steps in phase 2 of the ceasefire are politically disastrous for him. His coalition
because this is pretty big, isn't it? It's all the hostages home, but permanent ceasefire and the IDF beginning to withdraw from Gaza.
Yeah, and leaving the Philadelphia corridor. There is huge opposition for that within the more extremist elements of his government, and certainly they will scent weakness. What also doesn't help is that, I mean, right from the beginning, this has been the case. But the idea there's no clear Israeli vision for the day after, or not even a clear Israeli vision, like beyond a sort of apocalyptic general's plan and so on. Who is going to govern Gaza? The right of his coalition will not accept the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority will not accept being the sort of policeman for Israel, as they're widely seen in the West Bank. There is very, very little clear signals as to what happens next, apart from the fact that Netanyahu is in Washington, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, is also very deeply involved. And Hamas and Israel know that what Trump wants is really going to be the top priority here. Top of his shopping list is the much vaunted normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. That was looked like it was about to happen on October the 6th, just before the Hamas incursion. But, many things have changed. Trump, in his previous term, oversaw the Abraham Accords, which was the normalization peace deals with a handful of some Gulf states. And that's held. That's been very, very stable. And it's clear that Saudi Arabia is the next thing on the table. How to get there is much trickier.
I mean, to return to Gaza, Philippe, we saw that the hostage releases at the weekend, though there was an amount of grotesque theatrics involved, were a great deal less chaotic than the previous ones we'd seen. Do you get a sense that Hamas now are trying to position themselves to play some sort of role in post-war Gaza, even though it seems fairly clear to me, at least, that there is absolutely no appetite for that either from Israel or indeed really any Arab states?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right on that. It's clear that Hamas have diminished and weakened, it might be now, following the months or even now years of war. And Israeli intervention in Gaza is still in place. And I think the release of Israeli hostages was a chance for them to show that they were still in command. I think it was the very, very theatrical, as you would expect from Hamas, the release of hostages, and also using them to parade them, etc., which was particularly, I think, in very bad taste. But I think it is sending a political message, showing we're still there. We're still there. Israel hasn't been able to get rid of us, and we're still governing Gaza. That's what it means. I think what I note also, what is important is that Israel has largely withdrawn from Gaza. I don't know how long the ceasefire will hold, but I think now there's a transfer of the hostilities, and the Israeli notably now attacking even more the West Bank, which I think is a big worry. The second point I would also note, since Netanyahu is flying to Washington this week, is that the announcement made by Trump last week about the displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza to we don't know where, to some Arabic countries.
Egypt and Jordan, you
yes.
seem to be suggesting, though neither Egypt nor Jordan seemed terribly enthusiastic.
So we can hope and pray that it was one of those Trump announcements off the top of his head, and that some sensible advisors will tell him not to do that or try to do that, because, of course, that will not help.
On the subject of the escalations on the West Bank, Daniella, is it clear yet what Israel is doing there? They claim, as they always do, that they are striking terrorist infrastructure, and they may well be, but it may also be that thing where not for the first time these are entire apartment buildings which have perhaps one person of interest residing in them, and many people are rendered homeless if they're lucky as a result. Tulkarm's mayor, Abdullah Kamil, says he estimates that 15,000 people have fled Tulkarm, which is a distance from Jenin, obviously, but that's still maybe a quarter of the population of his town.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be impossible for me to assess what Israel is doing in the West Bank. I think it would be impossible for almost anybody to assess what Israel is doing in the West Bank. I mean, the Gaza war has had all the attention, but operations, military operations, security operations have been ongoing in the West Bank, and the toll is it becoming extraordinarily high. I think 70 people have been killed since the beginning of this year in the West Bank, including children, civilians. The issue is, though, that there is a very, very vanishing little domestic Israeli resistance to this, apart from the usual suspects and tiny minority on the left. In terms of outside pushback, well, the Trump government rescinded the sanctions on some settler leaders and so on. In combination with the IDF's operations, also there is a huge outbreak of settler violence as well. The right wing of Netanyahu's coalition are very, very clear: no Palestinian state, no Palestinian sovereignty in the West Bank. So in terms of any Israeli strategy in the West Bank, it seems more towards that. So without any pushback from allies or outside actors, I can only expect this to just continue in the West Bank.
Well, just as a final thought on this one, Philippe, and it is a depressing one, but Joe Biden's administration was criticised widely, and not without reason, for its apparent lack of attempt to restrain Israel in any way whatsoever. I think it would be riotously optimistic to expect the Donald Trump administration to make any greater effort to impose any restraint here. So would Netanyahu have internalised from this that he can basically do as he pleases and there won't be an awful lot of ramification?
Yes, probably so, and that's quite depressing to say it, because Biden should and probably could have done more to stop, or to try at least to bargain, because that's really a question of bargaining. Israel, benefits largely from American support, military, financial, etc. So I think he was in a position to bargain, and I don't think he really used that bargaining power to try to resist or slow down what Israel was doing in Gaza. But of course, it was a little bit silly on the part of some pro-Palestinian activists, notably in America, to think that by getting rid of Biden, you could even see during the run-up to the election some saying, well, we won't vote for Biden because he's a genocide Joe, etc. It was absolutely obvious that Trump would be worse, and he is proving worse, of course. For all these reasons, I think there's not much to play now for America, because I think I don't know. Maybe Daniella will think otherwise. I think she's reacting to what I'm saying, and she disagrees with me. So over to you.
It's always good to disagree. No, I mean, I don't think that it's as clear cut. I don't think Netanyahu's going to have a free hand now. I think when it comes to this, certainly the Trump White House is going to be very clear that they're running the show. Really, they're going to be directing Middle East policy rather than going along with what Netanyahu wants. And actually, but strangely enough, from across the Middle East, people, have almost many cases openly welcomed the Trump presidency, because he really, in his previous term, he got stuff done. He really got stuff done. He's already got stuff done now. I mean, the Gaza ceasefire was carefully orchestrated to happen the day before his inauguration. And to a certain degree, his aims and Netanyahu's aims align. And Netanyahu's the first foreign leader to be hosted, and they're going to have a private dinner afterwards. So they're chums. But I don't think it's a question of Trump acting according to Netanyahu's convenience. And I think Netanyahu might have some really unpleasant surprises coming in the next few days.
Well, to Tokyo now, and to a reminder of one of the perennial difficulties of encouraging people towards high-density living, i.e. other bloody people, or in this particular instance, other bloody people's dogs. It has emerged that between the 23 local authorities in Japan's tightly packed capital, upwards of 3,000 complaints are filed annually about canine behaviour, largely pertaining to untoward woofing, but also to the lackadaisical disposal of what dogs leave behind. Hat off to the sub-editors at the Japanese daily The Mainichi, from whence we gleaned this yarn for the headline Barking Mad. Very good. I hope somebody was given the afternoon off after that one. Daniella, first of all, because I know full well that you live in an apartment block in London, has this ever been an issue where you are, do the people next door have a wolfhound on the premises?
No one is. It's a local authority block. You're not supposed to have dogs. This does not prevent lots of people having dogs and letting their dogs poo in the communal courtyard. There's been much sort of fist waving and sort of grumbling by me. I think I was thinking about that. I think the good option would be, you know how you have Neighbourhood Watch? You could institute that with like Neighbourhood Dog Watch. Really like
the name may need work.
I don't know, Neighbourhood Barking Neighbourhood. We can work on that. But I think you want to crowdsource this, because I think, even people who love dogs don't want to step in dog turds.
No. I mean, probably on the internet there are specialist websites.
Ooh.
But that notwithstanding, Philippe, have you ever lived next to a pestilential animal? Have you perhaps even owned one?
No, I don't own one, but I once had a neighbour who left two rather big dogs in his small flat all day long, going to work, I suppose, and the dogs, of course, kept barking all day long, and I think that was probably a very poor treatment of animals, of pets. And fortunately, it happens. And I think no one is obliged to have children, but probably also no one is obliged to have pets. If you have some, treat them, take good care of them. We're not going to make ourselves any friends with the pet lovers, I'm afraid, I think, tonight. But I think that's a fair point to make, probably, because, yes, it's a difficult coexistence sometimes. But I think it's not a pet issue, it's an honor issue, I would say.
Yeah, the problem is usually at the other end of the lead, though. On that subject, Daniella, the thing that struck me, though, there are 550,000 dogs registered in Tokyo, which is a large number. 3,000 complaints annually. Is it, in fact, arguable that Japanese dogs, in keeping with national stereotype, are, in fact, remarkably courteous?
I imagine that there's a lot of passive aggression and sort of Japanese fist shaking and grumbling, and that so sort of 3,000 must be like the sort of particularly egregious.
I mean, those people must be furious. But I mean, there will be more of this sort of thing, won't there? Though, because there was a huge surge in pet ownership during the lockdowns around the world for obvious reasons. People now work from home more often, so therefore there will be more pets and therefore probably more complaints.
Yeah, pets and foxes in London, because you also have to coexist. I don't know if it's they're not pets, but they're so incredibly fearless. I don't know, I see them in my neighbourhood. So that's another issue. People talk a lot about foxes, but that's a very London issue, of course. I think I can understand why people who now work from home more than before the pandemic would want to have a pet. And I think that's a good thing, probably. It's just finding, abiding by the rules. And I think there must be rules because, of course, everyone should, in a public space, behave and respect other people's freedom.
Well, listeners can address all their complaints to Philippe Marlière personally. Philippe Marlière and Daniella Peled, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, if you read biographies of most major tech companies, the government of the time is usually a pesky side character that periodically enters the narrative as a bane to the heroic efforts of the CEO. Not quite so for House of Huawei, the secret history of China's most powerful company, written by the Washington Post's technology policy reporter Ava Dou. Huawei has, in its rise to global prominence, its incitement of the ire of Donald Trump and its subsequent expulsion from much of the Western market being kind of a mirror to the development of modern China. Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid spoke to Ava earlier and began by asking her to give some context to Huawei's founding.
So Huawei today is the largest maker of telecommunications equipment in the world, and it has been for some years. It has a pretty long history. It was founded in the late 1980s in China, and it was one of the first wave of private tech companies that were allowed in China as they were moving from a purely planned economy into this hybrid mix of capitalism and state planning that they have now.
Yeah, and with its founder, Ren Zhongfei, he's sort of famously called, I believe it was The Economist you write, called him the Invisible Ren. Why does he have this reputation, and can you tell us a bit about him and his upbringing?
Yes. So Ren Zhongfei, the founder, since the early days of Huawei, he's had this sort of premonition that having too high of a profile for the company or himself would bring the wrong kind of scrutiny and would make his company be seen as a threat by Western countries. And this indeed did come to pass in the first Trump administration. So for most of this company's history, for decades, he was one of the rare executives of a major tech company that never did interviews, that didn't appear for public speeches. And he ordered his executives around him to also take a very low profile. And so there's been sort of this lingering mystery surrounding the company.
And you mentioned there, that the scrutiny eventually did come for Huawei. But do you think that the secrecy part is actually one of the main reasons why that scrutiny came?
Yeah, the secrecy part of it definitely increased sort of distrust abroad about this company, because a number of China's major private companies have become publicly listed, which means a certain amount of regular disclosures to shareholders. And so Huawei has remained a privately owned company. This is something that the founder, Mr. Ren, has thought to be a core part of their strategy, because it means they're not at the mercy of the whims of the stock market movement in their long-term planning. But what it also means is that to this day, there's a lot of questions about exactly what percentage of shareholding that different people have in the company that just aren't publicly known. And that's contributed to some of these questions about the company. As for why they became sort of the target number one during the first Trump administration, has to do partly with just how powerful they became in the global tech ecosystem during that time. It was with the rollout of the 5G generation of wireless technology that it just became very, very clear that they weren't just a copycat sort of company, that as far as patents, as far as fundamental R&D, they had really caught up to Western companies. And by many of these metrics, they had exceeded their Western rivals. And that was really an alarm bell for a lot of Western policymakers and made them rethink and redo a lot of their policies towards China.
And of course, it's interesting because Huawei has had to sort of become more independent and in a sense powerful as a result of these sanctions by moving much more of its capacities and its technologies in-house, so to speak. One thing that's fascinating reading about Ren is that he did seem to really admire a lot of other cultures and genuinely love parts of the US. I mean, he fell in love with Las Vegas, and the Huawei headquarters now has, 12 replicas of different European iconic cities. Do you think he's personally very disappointed at how this has all turned out?
I think certainly through the years, he's expressed these glimmers of uncomfortableness of how closely the company is aligned with the state in China, and sort of a wish to just be, purely a business participating in the world. But he's also very much a pragmatist. This is the reality that, his company based in China and viewed as a fundamental interest of the government cannot really escape that influence I think he does, he's built these Western-style castles, this like dreamscape on Huawei's campus in China. And he very much knows his customer base. His customers are every country excepting a few Western ones, including the United States right now. But almost every other country in the nation still continues to purchase Huawei equipment. They have made this effort to seem not just a Chinese company, but as part of the world.
And just to close, I just want to take the question that you quote a Der Spiegel journalist saying when he's on a visit, I believe he's speaking to Ren at the Huawei headquarters. He asks, is Huawei a rising or falling empire? What's your sense of that at the end of writing this book?
It feels that Huawei has probably reached its peak, at least for the near term, in that now it's viewed with such suspicion by the United States and increasingly by other Western nations that it's very hard to see it making the kind of business inroads that it did a few years ago. That doesn't mean the company is going away altogether. It's certainly here to stay and is still one of the biggest technology companies in the world, but it means it's no longer going to be growing at an exponential rate the way it was for many, many years.
That was the Washington Post's Ava Doe speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. Ava's book, House of Huawei, is available now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Philippe, Marlière and Daniella Peled. The show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.